All righty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our third steer profitability competition webinar for this cycle and the first of 2018. So happy New Year to each of you all. And so we appreciate you all finding time on what's likely a pretty busy day. I'm guessing a number of you went back to school today. The weatherman tells us that almost all of us are battling some level of severe weather. Some extent or another. So I appreciate you all and your parents and families taking the time to make sure that you're on here this evening. For those who listen later, we say thank you to you as well. We have a treat for you this evening in terms of presenters, but before we get to that particular team of folks, just 2 or 3 really quick housekeeping pieces for me to remind you of. One, continue to remind you that you have write-ups that are due in a timely fashion. And so we need those within the first week. If that is a problem for you for whatever reason, and certain times there are legitimate reasons, then please let us know. Other than that, those penalties are and will be enforced. So make sure that you are doing those in a timely fashion. Remember, the penalty, miss more than one of those write-ups, you are removed from the competition and will never see how your animal ranked relative to the others. So just as a reminder on that. Also, as your parents, no question, have taught you, and as you'll continue to teach your friends, and probably the way that you would teach one of your friends who borrowed $5 from you for lunch at school, you would remind them, pay your bill. Should you not have done that just yet to ASA for your first round of expenses, you need to get on to the computer. You need to take time to get that done very, very quickly. We'll give you a little latitude in this first month and a half as you figure out the system, but should there be outstanding accounts beyond that, you too will then be removed from the ability to gain information on your CAF. And in fact, in that situation, if you're not paying bills, we will not show any information on your CAF throughout the entire project. So we need our bills paid, and we need to get paid in timely fashion. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to us later. Don't want to bring that up to anybody specific on this webinar. Update on the cattle. Again, you saw in the most recent newsletter some just general comments from staff at the University of Missouri Feedlot. They continue to be very, very impressed with your cattle. Ideally, most months by now, we will have some monthly weights for you and a little bit of information to share. Unfortunately, because of the holiday season, they were getting those weights today instead of yesterday. And so as a result, and that was very late today, they were trying to get those. And so at this point, I do not have those in hand, and so I will not share those with you, but you will see them very directly, probably in the next number of days, be popping up on the SPC site. So I would tell you to continue to watch, and you'll see that data up. Now this evening, I told you there was a treat coming, and that treat is that you get 2 of ASA's own staffers, 2 of the bright minds that are on this particular group. Dr. Jack Atkins. You've got to meet Dr. Atkins on calls to this point, but you're going to get to hear a little bit more from her this evening. Dr. Atkins, as you can see, is the Director of Science and Education. And along with her, then she's going to team up with the Grand Poobah at American Simmental, and that's Dr. William Shafer. So we are fortunate that both Dr. Shafer and Atkins are going to take the time to talk to you, as you can see on the screen, the basics of EPDs and indexes. And as you know, if you're a part of the ASA atmosphere at any level, you know the importance of using successful genetic predictors. And so that gives you tools going forward that are valuable, highly accurate. You can do a lot of great things. And if you recall from that very first webinar we had when we shared the demographics of your steers, you can recall how impressive your steers were as a group for EPDs for average daily gain, carcass weight, marbling, and the selection indexes of API and TI. And so if you want to refresh your mind on those numbers, you certainly can go back and do that at a later time. So this is at the core of what we do, is both animal breeders, as livestock folks selecting and making cattle better. We need all the tools in our toolbox that we can use and have at our disposal. And so at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Atkins as she starts to share with you that crash course. Jackie, it's yours.
All right. Thank you, Chip. Hopefully you all can hear me well. Happy New Year to everybody. I wanted to mention, if you click on your dashboard, if you click on the attendees and beside your name, there's a little hand column. If you have a question, click on that square by your name, and we'll make sure to give you some audio so you can ask a question. You can also chat or write in questions in the question or chat field, and we'll try and keep our eyes on that for questions as we go through this today. I mentioned that because I love the interaction, and if, I've got a slide set here with some questions throughout and designed to try and instigate some of that interaction. But really, if we go through 10 slides and leave 10 slides undone, but we had a lot of questions from you all, we would be just tickled pink. So please feel comfortable in starting that conversation. Odds are there's somebody else out there with a similar question. So we're happy to field those at any point. You don't need to wait until the end by any means. Chip mentioned weather, and I had an email come through last night, and my, not quite my hometown, but my parents' hometown, both came from Hettinger, North Dakota, a small town on the North Dakota-South Dakota border in kind of southwestern North Dakota. It was the coldest place on earth yesterday. It was 45 degrees below zero with no wind chill. That was the actual temperature. So speaking of weather and, being thankful that you all could take the time to come and visit with us when there's conditions like that, I really echo Chip's thoughts there, and things can be pretty extreme this time of year. So with that, we'll jump in here. I'll try and minimize the screen here so I can see it a little bit better. So I guess talking about EPDs and selection indexes, you might, for some of you, this might be really exciting talk and really interesting. And for others, you might be thinking, well, you guys sure put a lot of emphasis on it. I'm just not that into it. Why should this be important to you? And I think a staggering fact of the beef business is that time's really not on your side. The bull that you buy this spring, you could have his genetics in your herd 15 years from now or more, contributing to the calf crop. And so you really have to be forward thinking and appreciate the gravity, the impact that those decisions have today, 15 years from now. And for some of you, that you're not even 15 years old yet. Think of what you will be doing 15 years from now, and the thought that you might still have some of those same genetics in your herd is a big deal, and it should be something that you study and that you are thoughtful about. Between the sire and the maternal sire, that accounts for 75% of the genetics in your herd, and so we talk a lot about bull selection just because of that high impact that they have on the calf crop. And so knowing those two individual animals, 75% of the makeup of that calf. And so really, again, can't emphasize enough putting some thought and some study into who you are going to select to be future sires in your herd, and not to discount the female part of it. The female contributes half of her genetics, obviously, to the calf, but on a whole, it's a smaller impact as the sires are. Using EPDs, you read anywhere from 7 to 10 times more accurate than any other genetic measurement. And really, if you talk to animal breeders or geneticists, people who are trained in this science, there's nobody that says that there's some other tool that works better than EPD. And EPD is the gold standard. You can add pieces of information to that, like adding genomics. You can change your methodology for calculating those EPDs. But there's nobody out there saying, oh, those EPDs, they just don't work. There's no more accurate tool to get at a prediction for, the trait than to use an EPD. In selection indexes, again, we talk about gold standards. Selection indexes is kind of the gold standard for multi-trait selection. So what you don't want to do is get yourself in a scenario where you're selecting on one trait over and over and over and over and over again and making great progress in that one trait. But because it's related to other traits, you see, negatively related to other traits, you see production in that other trait plummet, and that can be pretty detrimental. So you want to have kind of the whole picture in mind, and the best approach to do that is using a selection index, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So really the goals for the day, the understanding EPDs and selection indexes in an hour is kind of a lofty goal, but when you boil them down, they're pretty simple to use. And so we want to provide a little bit of background on what a phenotype is and what it influences. And really that leads us into why EPDs are important. So we'll define EPDs and learn how best to use an EPD. We would like you to walk away understanding a percentile rank, which could arguably be just as important as understanding an EPD. And knowing the raw number of an EPD is not all that important, but it's how they compare, how they rank compared to other animals from that same evaluation. And we'll show you where to find those percentile ranks on our site. Again, another component of an EPD that's important to understand is the accuracy associated with that EPD. So we're going to talk about accuracy and what that kind of means about our confidence in those EPDs. And then at the end, we've got some slides to dig into selection indexes a little bit more and kind of touch on the thinking behind how those are developed and how you can use them. And along the way, like I said, really hoping that this is an interaction. I've thrown in some questions here that we can hopefully have Wade Shafer give his 2 cents on. These are questions that we hear frequently from members and from other people that we've done similar talks with. So Wade, at any time, feel free to chime in on those questions or anything else I'm saying if your audio is working. So really the basics here, ground zero, is to understand what a phenotype is, and that's just the observable characteristic of an individual trait. So that might be their weight at different points of their life, it might be their height, it could be their coat color, it could be something like a pregnancy, whether or not they're pregnant is a phenotype. And that phenotype is influenced by 2 things, by genetics of the animal and the environment that they were exposed to. And it's just that simple. But getting at the genetic component is not always that simple, because we don't always know what portion of the phenotype is due to the environment and what portion of it is due to the genotype of that animal. And we get at that by using, what we know about EPDs and genetics to try and zero in on the genetic potential for that animal for that particular trait. So one of the things that influences this relationship is the heritability for the particular trait. So heritability explains how much the variation of the phenotype is explained by the genetics of that animal. And so it's a range from 0 to 1, 0 having no heritability and 1, being a perfectly herited trait. For example, coat color. If you have the black gene, you're going to have the black phenotype. There are certainly most of the traits that we talk about have a spectrum of being lowly heritable to highly heritable. Lowly heritable traits are traits where the genetics play a small role in the phenotype. So most of the component, most of the influence of that trait, of that observation, is due to the environment, and a smaller component is due to the genetics. Highly heritable traits, the opposite is true. Most of the influence of that phenotype is due to the genetics of the animal, when environment might play a smaller role. So certainly traits like fertility are known to be lowly heritable traits, and traits like structure and some carcass traits are highly heritable. The highly heritable traits are a lot easier, or you can make more progress through selection, even with the phenotype. Although still arguably the best way is with an EPD if one exists. The lowly heritable traits, it's a lot harder to make a selection based on phenotype, because so much of that phenotype is determined by the environment, where it can kind of mask the genetic component. So with that, Wade, I don't know if you are able to talk, but one of the things that we hear a lot is people saying that they cull all their open cows, and so they must be making big progress in selecting for fertility in their cow herd. And I guess I would put to the group whether or not you think this is a true statement or a false statement. I'll give you a little time to think that through, and then Wade, if you want to give us your 2 cents on the statement like this.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me, Jackie?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so I will answer that. Before I do, I would like to go back to the definition of heritability, and it was in Jackie's previous slide. I think the way I always like to think about it, it helps me intuitively understand heritability. It's the proportion of the differences that we see in a trait. And differences is just a more down-to-earth word for variation. In the world of statistics, we talk about variation, and variation is simply differences. So a proportion of those differences that we see in a trait that are due to genetics. So with this, in this particular case where Jackie's asking about fertility and the implication that many of us have about culling is that, boy, if we get rid of the problem animals, in other words, the open animals, the animals that seemingly have a problem with fertility, we're going to make lots of genetic improvement. Well, unfortunately, this assumption that culling your open cows is going to gain you a lot of ground from a genetic standpoint, in other words, improve your genetic fertility, is false. And the problem is that when it comes to fertility, fertility is a lowly heritable trait. And that means that the differences we see between animals and fertility, and typically we measure that by whether or not they're bred or open, the differences we see are largely due to non-genetic factors. Therefore, if we're culling open animals, we're going to be culling lots of animals that might be superior genetically for fertility, but for whatever reason, for whatever non-genetic reason, they turn out to be open. So when it comes to improving fertility, in order to truly make, or in order to make much genetic progress, we need to have EPDs. And if you're a commercial producer, obviously you're not going to have EPDs on your females. But when you go to buy bulls, if you want to improve your herd's fertility, you want to pay attention to the fertility, the EPD for fertility on that bull. And some breeds will have stayability, some will have heifer pregnancy, some will have both. They're both important traits in the gauging of fertility. But if you want to make progress as a commercial producer, you need to use those EPDs for fertility. If you are a seed stock producer and you are in a genetic evaluation system that has those traits on females, you have the latitude to be able to make selection decisions on your females as well for fertility. But when Jackie showed about the slide about how important EPDs are, they're even more important. Having EPDs are absolutely critical if you want to make genetic progress in a lowly heritable trait. If you have a lowly heritable trait like fertility, you are going to make virtually no genetic progress unless you have EPDs. So absolutely critical to have EPDs for lowly heritable traits.
Thanks, Wade. We had a couple of folks chiming in that they thought that was false, and so yeah, you got it. Great explanation. So most of the traits that we're going to talk about, well, pretty all the traits that we're going to talk about today are polygenic traits. So these are traits that are influenced by many genes, 10 genes, hundreds of genes. The truth is we don't know how many genes are influencing a lot of these traits. And compared to simply inherited traits that are controlled by one gene, we can pretty readily figure out what the progeny or progeny outcomes you can expect from mating two animals if you know what they carry for those genes. Where polygenic traits, you can't get to that outcome very readily because there's so many genes that influence it. And so really what we need there are the development calculations of expected progeny differences in order to understand how you would expect their progeny to function in a lot of these different production traits. So EPDs, they estimate the performance of progeny for a specific trait, and it's given in units of that trait. So if it's a weight, like weaning weight or birth weight or yearling weight, it's given in pounds. It's calculated by collecting records on the individual themselves, by understanding records and pedigree information, linking to other relatives. And the real key is once you start getting progeny records from that animal, then you really start to zero in on the EPD for them. And all of that is to kind of reduce the noise associated with the phenotype that's contributed by the environment or by things that aren't heritable. So what we're really trying to focus in on is the genetic component that contributed to that phenotype. And so the difference between two EPDs for two animals would tell you the expected difference on average for their offspring, assuming a similar environment. So if you expose one group to this really outstanding environment and the other group is just really meant to rough it, that's not a fair comparison. So we design contemporary groups to kind of, like like a race for individuals' progeny, and what you want to do is design that race fairly so that all of the animals within those contemporary groups are exposed to pretty similar management. But really, the EPDs can be boiled down to 4 components. We have pedigree information, so what we know about their sire, about their dam, about any other relatives can feed into how we expect that animal to perform. Their individual performance data, their own weaning weight or their own performance records can also feed into the EPD. Progeny performance data, like I said, this is really where we start to see high accuracy or higher accuracy associated with the EPD, is when we start getting calves in on those animals and how those calves perform. And certainly genomic predictions is playing a bigger and bigger role, and we talked about this some 2 months ago, so I won't get into this too much tonight, but the genomic information, there's nothing magical about it. It's just adding more information to what we know to those calculations for an animal's expected progeny difference. So it's just simply data that we get to add. And like I said, once we start getting really progeny data, lots of progeny data, that's when we really zero in on the EPD. So Wade, here's another question that we hear. A certain person calls in and their bull had a really high weaning weight, but the EPD that's calculated for that bull is actually pretty low for weaning weight, and you know, inferring that EPD is probably wrong. And so what would you say to a call like that?
Well, Jackie, I think first and foremost, we have to keep in mind that a phenotype is a combination of an animal's genetic merit for a trait plus the environment it was exposed to. So in the EPD is solely the breeding value or the genotype that the animal, the additive, what we would say the additive component of the genotype, the part of the genotype that is passed on, that is what an EPD measures. So there's certainly all kinds of examples where you can have a very impressive weaning weight, yet the animal, its actual genetic value for weaning would be not nearly as impressive. For example, if you have cattle that are raised in a very plush environment, they can have very impressive weaning weights. Say they're on creep feed, they have access to tremendous creep feed and great grazing and so forth. It's not unusual to see very impressive weaning weights. That does not necessarily mean they have superior genetics for weaning weight, even though they can have, under those conditions, can have some very impressive weaning weights. You also see within a contemporary group, you're going to see some animals that might be up towards the top of the contemporary group for weaning weight. So we would then assume that they must have tremendous genetics for weaning. Well, within a contemporary group, just due to chance, for whatever reason, an animal can have a superior weaning weight and not have genetically superior weaning weight. One example would be if it had a tremendous mother that milked a lot. It might have, that mother might pass on, say the mother has tremendous genes for milk, of course they would be passed on to the calf, but the calf might not have a lot of what we call direct weaning weight, which is weaning weight due to genes for growth and not milk. So a heavy milking cow can wean off a heavy calf, but that calf itself might not have tremendous genes for, or superior genes for weaning weight. And those are just a couple of quick examples, but it is very typical for traits, phenotypes to be different, and potentially very different than what the animal's genetic value is, and that's frankly why we have EPDs. If the phenotypes and the genotypes were the same thing, there would be no need to have EPDs. We just simply measure the phenotype. And on highly heritable traits, traits like frame score, for example, that's highly heritable. What you see is a very good indicator of an animal's genetic value for hip height. But for a trait like weaning weight, we're only talking about 25% heritability, roughly 20 to 25% heritability. And that means the difference you see in weaning weight within a contemporary group, the differences you see in weaning weight, only 25% of those differences are due to genetic values. 75% of them are due to non-genetic value. And that's within a contemporary group. So again, I'll just close with all my rambling and say it's not unusual to see animals that have very different phenotypes from what their EPDs or their genetic merit actually is.
Thanks, Wade. That's great. We did have one other question come in asking if an EPD is the expected difference. Let's see, why are the breed averages for EPDs not zero? How do we get to where we set that baseline?
Well, so over time, you could start out with a base that was zero. The average animal, for instance, born in 2005 could be set to zero. However, over time, if you're making genetic progress, each generation you will see a change away from zero, movement away from zero, as far as the average animal. So the zero base, technically the zero base is what, when it comes out of a genetic evaluation, zero is what foundation animals, and when I say foundation animals, those are animals that have no pedigree. You can't trace them back any further. They would be coming out of a genetic evaluation. Those animals, the average of those animals would be zero. But for lots of different reasons, we move bases around, and it's very arbitrary. The thing about a base is it's very arbitrary. You can subtract or add to an EPD or a set of EPDs, and it does not change anything about how the animals rank, and that's what's relevant when it comes to EPDs, how animals rank. If you added 50 to all of our yearling weights, sure, there might be some people that puff their chest out a little more, but it doesn't change the genetic value at all of that set of animals.
Great. Thanks, Wade, and good question. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about percentile ranking in a little bit. That will kind of back that up, what Wade has just said. But here's an example of two bulls, and bull A has a weaning weight EPD of 60. Bull B has a weaning weight EPD of 70 pounds. And what you should take away from this is those are average, the average you would expect out of the progeny of these bulls. There's going to be a bell-shaped curve, so there will be progeny that underperform, and there will be progeny that overperform, and not only their phenotype, but just in their genetic potential that they inherited from the sire. And so one of the questions that we have come up is, or an instance that we see where people maybe lose faith in EPDs a little bit, is that they may see some calves that outperform another set of calves, and the EPDs didn't predict that, and I guess, so the question would be whether or not, just based on what we know with EPDs, whether or not this can be feasible. Can bull A have calves that weigh less than the first bull, the bull with the lower EPD? And the answer to that is absolutely true. You can have a spectrum along this bell-shaped curve. You've got the average is going to line up around that 70 for the second bull and around 60 for the first bull, but there will be calves that, through kind of the random shuffling of the genes that influence weaning weight, they kind of drew the short end of the stick, and they don't do as well. And there will be bulls or calves out of the first bull, bull A, with the lower weaning weight, that, again, through that random shuffling of all the genes that influence weaning weight, for whatever reason, they got the best ones. And so it's absolutely possible that you can have these differences and the EPDs still be accurate. And this is assuming, similar environmental influences. So percentile ranking is an important tool for you all to be aware of. It's just a quick reference, a very intuitive reference for making comparisons. And what I like about percentile ranking is you might not know what a calving ease 7.2 means if you're not familiar with our EPDs and whatever base we're using. But the percentile rank is a quick way to show you how they compare to all the other animals in that breed type in that evaluation. And so you can see that here is just an example of an animal that has calving ease of 7.2, birth weight of 2.7, weaning of 71.4, yearling 107, an average daily gain of 0.22 pounds per day. Really, for many people, unless you have what our breed averages memorized in your head, you're not necessarily going to know whether or not those are good or bad numbers. But if you look at the percentile, which is listed for each individual animal with this percent symbol there, you can quickly see how that animal ranks compared to other animals in that same breed type. So lower number is better. So you can think of it as, if you saw one there, that would be the top 1%. So they're in the top 1% of all other animals in that breed type. So lower number is better or more competitive. The way you could read this is this bull is, oops, I changed some things, so this isn't accurate. The bull is in the 20th percentile for weaning weight, not yearling weight. I wanted to stick with weaning weight since we've talked so much about that. So how do you find these? If you go to Herd Book and go to data search, and there's this percentile and EPD averages, you hover on that, and it pulls up this sub menu, second menu, and you can find these percentile tables for hybrids, Simbra, full bloods, purebred animals. And here's, what that table might look like. So if you're just want to kind of get a feel for, what are the 1% animals across all these breeds, the percentile ranking is on the far left, and the trait of interest is going along the headers for each of these rows. And so yeah, going back to our previous example where we had a weaning weight of around 70, so you could look up that animal here and you would see, yep, that's the 20th percentile for weaning weight. So any questions? We didn't really design a question on percentile rank, but I'm just going to pop into the dashboard and make sure we don't have any questions on how to use percentiles. Okay, so we're going to move on to accuracy. So the accuracy of the EPD is a reflection of how close the calculated EPD, these are approximations, so we're always trying to do the best that we can do to make these predictions, but they're approximations. And so the accuracy is how close that calculated EPD is to the true genetic value for the animal. Accuracy ranges from 0 to 1, 0 being not at all accurate and 1 being dead on. It's exactly the true value of the animal. The accuracy of the EPD is influenced by the number of records that we have for that animal, the type of record, if this is an indicator trait or an actual measurement, the relationship of the animal to where we are getting the record from, if it's their own performance, if it's relative, if it's their progeny. All of this influences the accuracy associated with that information. And so down here in the bottom, you can see a low accurate animal. We've got this theoretical true breeding value, or half of the true breeding value actually, but and in a low accuracy animal, the EPD that we're predicting might be further away from the true value, but as we get that EPD more and more accurate, in theory it's going to shrink down, and or the difference between those two lines will shrink down, and they'll line up one on top of the other. So another place that I wanted to point you to is this possible change table, which is really pretty valuable for understanding accuracy and what that means for the EPD. So if we've, and I've pulled up a couple of examples where we have 2 bulls, and they each have an accuracy associated with the calving ease EPD of 0.2. The first bull, his EPD is predicted as 15.4, and the second bull, his EPD is predicted as a 10.0. So with an accuracy of 0.2, you can use this possible change table and come up here, find 0.2, you go across and find which trait you're looking at. We're looking at calving ease. So that's the possible change that we would expect to see 2/3 of the time, if that makes sense. So it gives you a window where we are confident that his EPD is going to land 2/3 of the time, that 1/3 of the time it's going to be even outside that window. So going back to these 2 bulls, the possible change is 6.2. So we subtract 6.2 from 15 and we add 6.2 from 15. And so we get this range where that bull is likely to land as he gets more and more proven. So from 9.8 to 21.2 in the first bull. And so, these are with these low accuracy bulls, the odds are those EPDs are going to change, but this gives you a bit more of a range, a bit more of a comfort zone. So if we look at kind of play with some different scenarios here, we have a bull with the same EPD for calving ease, and accuracy is 20% or 0.2. Again, we've got that same range of 9.8 to 21.2. If you want to use a sire with a little bit more accuracy, but still the same EPD, reported EPD or calculated EPD, we go to a bull that has an accuracy of 60% or 0.6. His possible change, again with that 2/3 window comfort range that we expect that bull to end up in 2/3 of the time. The possible change is 3.1. So again, you add and subtract that off of 15, and here's our window. We expect that bull is going to land somewhere between 11.9 and 18.1. And if you crank that up and really use a high accuracy sire, a sire with 90 or 0.9 accuracy, the possible change is reduced to 0.1, so you end up with a range of 14.2 versus 15.8. So this is something that's valuable to think through when you're thinking about whether or not to use a young sire that's low accuracy or a more proven sire that's higher accuracy, and it depends on, I guess, what your comfort level is with that range. What you can see here with these three bulls is that bull C actually has the potential to really be a rock star. Within a pretty comfortable window, he could be up in the 21 range for calving ease, where bull E, this more proven bull, yeah, he's more proven, and so you're probably not you don't have as much of a risk of a train wreck, but you're also not going to push the envelope quite as much as you could with bull C. So one of the things that we talk about when we're talking to people about using lower accuracy sires is the concept of using multiple sires. So if you have 4 sires and they all have similar calving ease of 15 and their accuracy is low, it's at 20%, if you were using just one of these sires, then you've got a pretty large spread there, and so you might have some of those calving ease train wrecks or dystocia train wrecks. But if you're using 4 bulls, then you can divide that possible change by 4, and you'll come up with a possible change of 1.55. And so really, if you're using multiple sires, or in this instance 4 sires, that reduces that range pretty quickly to 14.45 to 16.55 on average out of that group of sires. Yes, there will be some that are rock stars and have really great calving ease and very little dystocia problems. Yeah, there might be some on the other end of the spectrum, but on average, you're going to get pretty close to what you were shooting to do with those EPDs. Wade, do you have anything to add on that? Oh, we've got a question.
No, I guess I'll listen to the question, but I'd say one thing, and this is a piece of advice that I think all people breeding cattle need to integrate, and that is that if you're going to use young sires, you need to use a number of them, because as Jackie has shown you, with young sires, there's a large range for possible change. In other words, an animal can be a young animal, its EPD its true EPD can be very different than what is predicted. So with young animals, the way and some people avoid young animals because of that. But if you're making genetic progress, the young animals on the average are going to be better than the older animals. But then people the logical response is, yeah, but how do I know which one? How do I know I'm getting the right one? Well, you don't, but when you use when you use a number of young animals, you get what their average is with very little range in the possible change of that group. So that's how to reduce your risk when you use young bulls, which is a good idea. There's nothing wrong with using young bulls, but if you do use young bulls, you need to use a number of young bulls. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, and the question we had, thanks to John for correcting my math, for full C, the range should be 8.8 to 21.2 instead of 9.8. That's what I get for trying to do things quickly. So thanks, John, for that. Let's see. So we've got about 9 minutes left, so we'll keep moving and see if we can cover the selection indexes. Whoops. So really, the gist of a selection index is to try and provide breeders and producers with a simple way to measure profit, considering multiple traits. And if you're new to the business, or even if you're schooled in the business and you're looking at, this plethora of traits, it's hard to know how much emphasis to put on all the variety of traits that we have here. And then you add to that the fact that a number of these traits have correlations, and so you increase weaning weight and you increase yearling weight, you also increase mature weight, which can increase the inputs that you have in maintaining the mature cows on your place. And so the goal of a selection index is to boil all these traits and all their correlations and all the costs associated with these production systems into one number that's pretty simple to understand, and it's just a dollar amount, a expected profit for each cow exposed. So so what these indexes do is they combine all the EPDs for the economically relevant traits associated with that production system. And so it's important to understand what that production system is that we're talking about. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are for ASA. There are a number of these selection indexes with different breed associations. So, just study them and try and understand what that system is mimicking. So we use costs and prices that are associated with the entire beef cycle, and out of that, we generate one number that predicts profit. And so our two indexes that we have, there's the all-purpose index, which is best to use when animals will be used to generate replacement heifers. And so that assumes a portion of the females will be held back and go on into the cow herd, and all remaining calves will be harvested. So it still puts emphasis on the carcass traits, but also needs to pull maternal traits as well. The terminal index is best to use when all calves, 100% of the calves, will be harvested, so that way you're not really worried about the maternal values, because you won't be making any replacements out of that. And so this graphic was developed by a breeder in Australia, and it really summarizes all the thinking that goes into the all-purpose index. And so a real simple equation for profit is your outputs, which are the traits that influence the income, the money coming in, minus your inputs, the traits that influence the expenses associated with your operation. And so how the all-purpose index works and the terminal index is to think of three sections of the beef industry, the cow-calf sector, the feedlot, and the abattoirs, or the packing plants, again, it was developed in Australia, so that's why there's words like abattoir. And then all the traits that influence the inputs and the outputs for each one of these sectors. And there will be traits like survival that we don't have a survival EPD, right? How do we get at that? Well, we use indicator EPDs, and the best way that we can do that for survival is a calving ease and maternal calving ease. There are traits like intake. Again, we don't have a published intake EPD, but we use some indicator traits like average daily gain and indications of the frame size and the fat of that animal to get at the feed intake estimate. And so anyway, so these this really boils down to a pretty simple equation: profit equals output minus input. And here we've got all of these components listed, what goes into the inputs and what goes into the outputs at each one of these sectors. And again, to remind you of the all-purpose index, it's really meant to be an index where you're keeping replacement heifers, but you're feeding out all of the other calves. So it's really looking at the entire beef cycle. If this was a graphic for a terminal index, we would not have like replacement weight rate would no longer be an input. Cow intake would no longer be an input. We still want to get at survival rate because you have to have a live calf that goes on to be fed out and harvested, but the maternal traits are no longer included in that index. So again, the whole concept behind multi-trait selection is to try and make selecting on several traits simple, and knowing how much weight you should put on growth versus fertility is hard to know unless you've got this kind of system that has gone through and figured out how important each one of those traits are and how important one unit of change is to the overall profit. And so they're really designed to be simple. It's just one number. You can still go through and fine tune it, find, weaning weight that is necessary to continue to sell bulls from your place, or a stability number that, boy, you just can't go under, or a calving ease number. But don't ignore these indexes. They are they're designed very thoroughly to look at profit across all the sectors of the industry. And one thing that we hear routinely is, I sell my calves at weaning, and people would like to design a new index, and it's fine. We can work towards designing a new index, but then you have to tell us what that production system is. And what you don't want to do, or what I would suggest we don't want to do, is to do an index that only looks at the traits, the economically relevant traits up to weaning, because everybody sells their calves at weaning. Well, in order for our cattle, our genetics, and our industry to continue to be valued and sought after, you need to pay attention to those carcass traits as well. You can't ignore that section of the industry. And so anyway, that's just a bit of a tangent. We've got a couple of questions that we've put together, and then some questions from the group. If one of the questions that we had, Wade, I'm trying to multitask here, was if we should select on both API and TI to select sires to make more genetic progress. Is there a benefit to using, or to looking at, to emphasizing both of those indexes simultaneously?
Well, I think there is a thought that by paying attention or using both API and TI, the all-purpose index and the terminal index, by using both of those when you're making selection decisions, you're making more progress, or you're going to create more genetic improvement. But that is not true. what you want to do is you want to decide how a sire is going to be used. If the sire is going to be used solely as a terminal sire, in other words, all of their offspring are going to be put in the feedlot and go to the packing plant, you absolutely need to use the terminal index and not API. The terminal index, if that's the way your sire is going to be used, you will make more profit or more progress by using the terminal index. Conversely, if you're going to keep replacement females, and then the cull heifers and steers are going to go in the feedlot and ultimately the packing plant, API is the index you want to use. And you should not pay attention to TI, because all the terminal traits that affect your cull heifers and your steers in the feedlot and the packing plant are already factored into API. So it's really, the decision is, or what you have to determine when you're making your selection decision is how the sire is going to be used. It's going to be used for siring replacement females, so you need to use API. If you're not going to keep any replacement females, you use TI. You do not want to try to weight them or to use both of them in your selection decisions.
Thanks, Wade. And we had one other question, if I can get back to it. So the question is, if you use indexes, do you need to use individual EPDs, or will that cause more emphasis on those individual traits than if you just select on the index on its own?
Well, the theoretical answer to that is that if you use indexes, you do not want to look at individual traits. And whoever asked that question and wondered if you you skew the selection pressure when you use individual traits plus an index, they're right on the money. That is true. Now, there's also practical concerns in the dairy industry, in the pig industry. I think it's fair to say that pig producers, dairy producers, and so forth, they use the indexes and they don't try to break the indexes down and get under the hood. In the beef business, it's a little bit different. For example, you might have a sire that is, you might be a seed stock producer selling bulls, and you might have a sire that has very high index, has a very high index value, say has a very high API value. But his offspring don't have much growth, and your customers are very averse to buying low growth bulls. So even though that bull is predicted to be highly profitable and would make your customers lots of money, if they don't buy the bulls because they don't have adequate amount of growth for their liking, then you're going to have problems as a seed stock breeder because they're not going to buy your bulls. So there is a bit of a practical balance you have to maintain in order to get your bulls sold. So selecting solely on the indexes, while that is something that's done in the pig industry, dairy industry, poultry industry, we're not at that point yet in the beef industry.
Thanks. That was a great question. And yep. And we had one more question, but I think I'm going to skip over it in the interest of time. A question from us, not a question from the group. If there's any more questions from the group, we'd be happy to field them. If not, really the take-home message that I would like everybody to walk away from is that EPDs are the most accurate way to select for qualitative traits. They're much more accurate than any individual records or you know, phenotypic appraisal. And really using well-designed economic selection indexes is the quickest way to get you to select for profit and the best way to use a multi-trait selection. So those are our big take-home messages for tonight. If you have any follow-up questions, we're happy to answer them. If not, and you think of something, you know, tomorrow night or next week or 2 months from now, shoot us an email, give us a call. We love talking about this. But otherwise, I'll just say thanks to everybody for paying attention and remind everybody to get your summaries in by next week, Tuesday, and look forward to continuing this year with you all.